For over 22 years, the village of Umuaka had suffered under a mysterious curse. No woman had given birth to a male child in 2 decades, and the last group of boys born in the village came 45 years ago. With time, the hope of seeing male children in the village started to fade. The village elders, led by the king, had tried every possible remedy. Priests and herbalists were consulted, sacrifices were made, but no one could break the curse. The community was left in despair, for without sons there would be no future for Umuaka. Among the people of the village was Ayo, the only young man left in Umuaka, now in his mid-20s. He had grown up surrounded by women, and the elders considered him the hope of their land. Despite the reverence the village showered on him, Ayo was burdened by the responsibility placed on his shoulders. The king himself had decreed that Ayo must marry at least 20 wives to increase the chances of giving birth to a male child. But Ayo had different plans. He believed in love and insisted he would only marry one woman, the one who truly captured his heart. The pressure from the village was immense. Noble families sent their daughters to Ayo's home, hoping he would choose one as his bride. The king's daughter, Princess Ife, was the most prominent of them all, doing everything in her power to capture Ayo's attention. However, Ayo remained resolute in his decision. He did not want to marry out of duty or for the village's expectations. He wanted a marriage built on love and mutual respect. It was a quiet night, and Ayo had just fallen asleep in his small hut, hoping for some peace after a long day. However, the peace was short-lived. The sound of soft whispers woke him up, and before he could fully understand what was happening, his door creaked open. A group of women from the village had sneaked into his hut, moving silently in the darkness. Ayo's heart began to race as he realized what they were trying to do. The women, laughing softly, gathered around his bed, their hands reaching out to touch him. Some touched his arms, others his chest, all of them eager to be close to him. Ayo felt trapped. He didn't want to hurt their feelings, but this was too much. He had always tried to be kind to the women of Umuaka, but he never asked for this kind of attention. As their hands continued to grab at him, Ayo knew he had to find a way to escape. In one quick move, Ayo jumped up from the bed, pushing his way through the group of women. They tried to pull him back, but he was faster. He dashed towards the door, ignoring their calls and protests. Once outside, he sprinted into the night, breathing hard but relieved to be free. He didn't stop running until he was far from his hut, where he could finally breathe in the cool night air in peace. Ayo didn't return to his hut right away. He needed to clear his head and think about what had just happened. He found a quiet spot under a large tree near the edge of the village and sat down, his heart still pounding. The village women had always shown interest in him, but sneaking into his home at night was crossing the line. It wasn't the first time they had tried something bold, but this was different. When the sun finally began to rise, Ayo made his way back to his hut, hoping the women had given up for the night. He locked the door securely behind him, not wanting a repeat of the previous night. As he lay back down, his mind kept racing. He knew the attention wasn't going to stop, but he was determined to stand his ground and live his life on his terms. Despite the midnight incident, the women of Umuaka found other ways to get close to Ayo. They had always admired him, but now it seemed like their admiration had turned into a competition. Every morning, Ayo would wake up to find buckets of water neatly placed outside his hut, as if by magic. At first he thought it might be a coincidence, but as it happened every day, he realized the women were taking turns fetching water for him from the river. It didn't stop there. Ayo began to notice that meals were being prepared for him as well. He would return home after a long day to find hot food waiting for him. The women were using their own money to buy the ingredients and cooking everything themselves. It was as if they thought feeding and caring for him would make him choose one of them as his wife. As the days passed, Ayo's house continued to be filled with food and water. The women of Umuaka, hopeful and determined, kept bringing him everything they thought he might need. They believed that if they cared for him enough, Ayo would eventually pick one of them to be his wife. It was a game they were all playing, though none of them realized that Ayo wasn't interested in playing along. The village elders were growing impatient, and whispers of discontent began to circulate among the people. Many saw Ayo's refusal to marry multiple women as a rejection of his responsibility to the village. Others, especially the maidens of noble birth, were insulted by Ayo's lack of interest in them. But Ayo was unmoved by the pressure. His heart yearned for a woman who would not see him as just the savior of the village, but as a man to be loved. During one of the meetings with the village elders, the king suggested a drastic measure. He believed the curse that had plagued their village for 45 years had a darker origin than they had initially thought. After consulting with elders from a neighboring village, the king learned that their predicament might be linked to an ancient tragedy. Many years ago, in the reign of the former king, a young prince had fallen deeply in love with a woman named Neka. She was an orphan with no family ties, living humbly on the edge of the village. Despite her lowly status, the prince loved her with all his heart and wanted to marry her. But the king and his council were firmly against the idea. They believed that Neka, an orphan with no noble blood, was unworthy of becoming a princess and the future queen of Umuaka. The elders, led by the former king, were determined to stop the marriage. They feared that allowing such a union would dishonor the royal family and weaken their standing in the eyes of the people. To them, status and lineage mattered more than love. So they conspired to end the prince's relationship with Neka in the cruelest way possible. Their actions would set the stage for a curse that would haunt the village for generations. When the prince continued to insist on marrying Neka, the king and his council grew desperate. They devised a plan to make sure the wedding would never happen. Neka was pregnant with the prince's children, triplets, though she did not yet know it. In their eyes, this only made her more dangerous, as her children would be the future heirs to the throne. The king and his council feared that the royal bloodline would be tainted by this union. One night, under the cover of darkness, the council kidnapped Neka. She was taken far from the village to a secluded forest, where no one would hear her cries. The elders had convinced themselves that they were protecting the village's honor by getting rid of her. They refused to acknowledge the evil in their hearts as they carried out their plan. Neka, terrified and alone, begged for mercy, but none was shown. The council, acting under the king's orders, buried her alive, along with her unborn triplets. It was a gruesome and heartless act, but they believed it would solve their problem. The prince was told that Neka had fled the village and abandoned him, never to be seen again. Heartbroken, he accepted the lie and eventually moved on, though he never truly forgot her. Little did the king and his council know that their decision would bring about a curse so strong it would affect the future of Umuaka for decades to come. The news of this past sin sent shockwaves through the village. The king and his council knew they had to find a way to break the curse, but the solution was as mysterious as the curse itself. The elders revealed that Ayo was the key. The curse would only be lifted if he fell in love with a woman and married her out of genuine affection. Yet Ayo had not found any woman who stirred his heart. While others sought to win him over with beauty or status, Ayo's heart remained untouched. Ayo's status as the last young man in Umuaka had made him the object of every maiden's desire. Whether they came from noble families or were ordinary villagers, the women of Umuaka were infatuated with him. Every time he walked through the village, maidens would gather around him, offering him gifts, flirting, and making grand gestures to gain his attention. Some were even bold enough to beg him to show them his private parts, having never seen one before. Despite all the attention, Ayo was indifferent. He found no joy in the constant admiration. The pressure from the maidens only made him retreat further into himself, longing for solitude. He began to avoid the public gatherings and sought out quiet places where he could be alone with his thoughts. Ayo knew that he would never find love in the crowds that followed him. He longed for a deeper connection, someone who saw him for who he truly was, not the village's savior, but a man with dreams, hopes, and desires of his own. One night, unable to sleep due to the weight of his thoughts, Ayo decided to sneak out of the village to get some fresh air. The night was calm, and the cool breeze soothed his troubled mind. He wandered through the forest near the outskirts of Umuaka, hoping to find peace in the silence. As he walked, a soft melody reached his ears, carried by the wind. The sound was so beautiful that Ayo's heart skipped a beat. Following the sound, he came upon a large tree where a young woman was sitting, singing quietly to herself. Her voice was like nothing he had ever heard before, gentle yet full of emotion. As he stepped closer, the woman noticed him and, startled, took off running. Ayo was left standing there, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't stop thinking about her, the woman with the beautiful voice who had disappeared into the night. That night, something shifted in Ayo, and he found himself yearning to see her again. From that night on, Ayo could not stop thinking about the woman he had seen by the tree. Her voice lingered in his mind, and he felt a deep connection to her even though they had not spoken a word. Every night, Ayo would return to the tree, hoping to catch another glimpse of her. But she never appeared. Days turned into weeks, and still, there was no sign of the mysterious woman. Ayo's thoughts were consumed by her. Who was she? Why had she run away? The more he thought about her, the more he realized that she was different from the other women in the village. Unlike the maidens who crowded around him, vying for his attention, this woman seemed untouched by the chaos of Umuaka. She was a mystery, and Ayo knew that he had to find her again, no matter how long it took. Unknown to Ayo, the woman he had seen was Ama, a quiet orphan who lived near the edge of the forest. She had grown up in isolation, never attending village gatherings or festivals. Ama had no family and had always preferred the solitude of nature to the bustling life of Umuaka. Her days were spent tending to her small garden and exploring the forest, where she found peace and comfort away from the village. Ama had always been aware of Ayo. She had seen him from a distance at the market and had heard the maidens gossip about him. But she had never imagined meeting him in person, let alone capturing his attention. That night by the tree, when she saw him approaching, her first instinct was to run. She couldn't believe that the most sought-after man in the village had noticed her. Afraid of what it might mean, she had fled. But deep down, Ama couldn't stop thinking about Ayo either. Ayo became obsessed with finding Ama. Every night he would return to the tree, hoping to see her again. He asked around the village about any woman who lived near the forest, but the maidens grew suspicious of his sudden interest in an unknown girl. Some even tried to follow him, hoping to uncover his secret. Despite their efforts, Ayo kept his mission quiet. One day, Ayo decided to take a walk through the outskirts of the village during daylight, hoping to catch a glimpse of Ama. As he wandered deeper into the forest, he found a small garden with well-tended plants and a simple hut. This place felt peaceful, untouched by the noise of the village. He sat quietly by a tree close to the hut. As the sun began to set, Ama returned from her daily gathering of herbs. From a distance, she noticed a figure sitting near her hut, and her heart raced. It was Ayo. She stood frozen, unsure whether to approach or run, but something inside her urged her to face him, so she cautiously walked toward the tree. Ayo stood as she approached, his heart pounding. He had finally found her. For a moment, they both stood in silence, unsure of what to say. Then Ayo spoke softly, thanking her for the song he had heard that night. Ama blushed, looking down at her feet, but Ayo's kindness eased her tension. He asked if he could visit her again, and Ama, though hesitant, agreed. From that day, Ayo began visiting Ama regularly, and slowly, a friendship began to blossom between them. Ayo and Ama's meetings became more frequent. They would sit under the tree, talking about their lives, their dreams, and the village. Ayo found comfort in Ama's quiet presence, unlike the constant attention he received from the other maidens. Ama, in turn, grew to trust Ayo, something she hadn't done with anyone in a long time. Despite their deepening bond, Ayo kept his relationship with Ama a secret. He knew the villagers wouldn't approve of his choice, especially since Ama was an orphan and not from a noble family. But the more time he spent with her, the more Ayo realized that he didn't care about her status. He had finally found the woman who made his heart beat, and nothing else mattered to him. As Ayo spent more time away from the village, rumors began to circulate. The maidens noticed that he was no longer around as much, and the elders started questioning his actions. Many believed that Ayo was hiding something, but no one could figure out what it was. The noble families, particularly the king's daughter, Princess Ife, grew increasingly jealous. One day, the king summoned Ayo to his palace. He expressed concern over the rumors and reminded Ayo of his duty to the village. The king, though kind in his words, was firm in his insistence that Ayo marry from the noble families. But Ayo remained quiet, unwilling to reveal his growing love for Ama. He knew that if he did, it would create an uproar in the village. Frustrated by Ayo's lack of response, the king issued an ultimatum. Ayo had to choose a wife from one of the noble families within the next 3 months. The king explained that the future of the village depended on him, and the elders agreed. If Ayo refused, they threatened to strip him of his status as the hope of the village, a move that could bring even greater pressure on him. Ayo felt trapped. He wanted to do what was right for the village, but his heart belonged to Ama. He knew that the villagers would never accept his choice, but he couldn't imagine living without her. Ayo left the king's palace feeling torn between his love for Ama and his duty to the village. As Ayo continued to visit Ama, he confided in her about the king's ultimatum. Ama listened quietly, her heart sinking with each word. She had always known that their love would face challenges, but she had hoped they could find a way to be together. Now it seemed impossible. Ama feared that Ayo would be forced to marry someone from the noble families, leaving her behind. Ayo, sensing her fear, reassured her that he would not marry anyone but her. He told her of the love he had found in her, something he had never felt with anyone else. But even as he spoke, Ayo knew that the path ahead was uncertain. The village's future depended on him, and he had to find a way to balance his love for Ama with the expectations of his people. Determined to fight for their love, Ayo came up with a plan. He decided that he would speak to the village elders himself and plead his case. He believed that if they could see how much he loved Ama, they might allow him to marry her, despite her status as an orphan. Ayo knew it was a long shot, but he was willing to take the risk for the woman he loved. Ama, on the other hand, was hesitant. She knew the villagers would never accept her, no matter how hard Ayo tried. She had lived her life on the outskirts of the village, always feeling like an outsider. But Ayo's determination gave her hope, and together, they decided to move forward with their plan, even though the odds were against them. With courage in his heart, Ayo approached the village elders to plead his case. He explained his deep love for Ama and his desire to marry her, not out of obligation, but out of genuine affection. The elders listened carefully, but their expressions remained stern. They reminded Ayo of the village's need for male children and the noble family's strong bloodlines. Despite Ayo's heartfelt speech, the elders were reluctant to grant his request. They argued that Ama, as an orphan, could not bring the honor and status needed to strengthen the village. Ayo countered, saying that love, not status, would break the curse. But the elders were not convinced. Ayo left the meeting disheartened, but his resolve to marry Ama remained strong. Word quickly spread through the village that Ayo had asked the elders for permission to marry Ama, the orphan from the forest. The reaction was swift and intense. Many villagers were outraged, especially the noble families who had hoped their daughters would be chosen. The maidens who had once adored Ayo now turned against him, and even the common villagers felt betrayed by his decision to marry an outsider. Despite the backlash, Ayo stood by his choice. He refused to be swayed by the anger of the villagers or the pressure from the noble families. He had made his decision, and no amount of hostility would change his mind. Ama, on the other hand, was deeply affected by the growing resentment. She feared for Ayo's safety and worried that the villagers would turn on him if they continued down this path. But Ayo remained steadfast, determined to fight for their love. The uproar in the village reached the king's ears, and he knew he had to act. He summoned Ayo to the palace once more, this time with the entire council of elders present. The king had always been a fair leader, but this time his patience was wearing thin. He reminded Ayo of the importance of his role in the village and the need to lift the curse. The king gave Ayo one final demand: choose a bride from the noble families or be exiled from the village. The choice was clear. Ayo could either fulfill his duty and save Umuaka, or he could follow his heart and leave everything behind. The weight of the decision pressed heavily on Ayo, but he knew deep down that he could not abandon Ama. He refused the king's demand, choosing love over obligation, even if it meant leaving his home forever. With a heavy heart, Ayo prepared to leave the village. The villagers gathered to watch as he packed his belongings, some shaking their heads in disappointment, while others muttered angrily under their breath. Even though Ayo had chosen love, he could not shake the sadness that came with leaving behind the village he had grown up in. Ama, waiting at the edge of the forest, watched as Ayo approached. She had heard the news and feared for what would happen next. But when Ayo reached her, his face was filled with a quiet resolve. They embraced, knowing that their journey together would not be an easy one, but they were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Together, they walked into the forest, leaving the village of Umuaka behind. As Ayo and Ama disappeared into the forest, the village was left in chaos. The noble families were furious, and many blamed the king for not forcing Ayo to comply. The elders tried to calm the villagers, but their anger only grew. Without Ayo, the future of Umuaka seemed uncertain, and the fear of the curse deepened. Some villagers began to question whether the curse would ever be lifted. They feared that without Ayo, no male children would ever be born again. But as the days passed, something unexpected began to happen. Kindly drop your comment, subscribe, and watch the part 2 of the story. What do you think will be the fate of Ayo, Ama, and Umuaka village?